Stream start.
So, welcome to Praxis 613. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be here at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt with you, Martin Saar, and with all of you, graduate students and friends and professors, to discuss the relationship between theory and praxis. The significance, the historical significance of being here from Columbia at the Institute to discuss this particular problematic doesn't escape me. In fact, it struck me full force when I was rereading our materials for this seminar and came across repeatedly the interconnections of our institutions. Just for instance, as I was ending Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason, which were based on his lectures delivered at Goethe-Universität in the spring of 1944, and it's signed Max Horkheimer, Institute of Social Research, parenthesis, Columbia University, parenthesis, March 1946. So it's particularly moving, for me at least, to be here to discuss with you all, and you, Martin, especially now that you're the professor of social philosophy here at the Goethe-Institutät in Frankfurt, and having assumed the chair of our dear colleague, Axel Honneth, in October 2017. Our seminar also has another important historical dimension. We will begin, perhaps, at the origin of the modern dialectic of theory and praxis, but then move to, perhaps, its most contemporary manifestation in the work of Bruno Latour, specifically in his most recent book, Down to Earth, Politics in the New Climatic Regime, just out in English, originally published in French, ou à décrire in 2017. That arc, our arc today, I think, is very significant because it begins with such a dramatic and lively controversy over the relationship between theory and praxis. And it ends, at least today, for the moment, in Latour's book, with such a stark, apocalyptic intervention that asks us, or that urges us, to reinvent, to rethink, to start from scratch on these questions of praxis. Right? And just to give a foreshadowing of where we are headed, where our seminar will reach, I point to this passage in Latour where he writes, and this is on page 33 of the English edition, or on page 47 of the original French edition, where he writes, and yet the entire political orientation depends on this step to the side. We shall really have to decide who is helping us and who is betraying us, who is our friend and who is our enemy, with whom we should make alliances and with whom we should fight, but while taking a direction that is no longer mapped out, he writes. Right? There is nothing, in any case, that authorizes us to reuse the old markers such as right and left, liberation, emancipation, market forces, or even the markers of space and time that have appeared self-evident for so long, such as local or global, future or past. Everything has to be mapped out anew, at new costs. What is more, this is an urgent task that must be carried out before the sleepwalkers, in their blind, headlong rush forward, have crushed what we care about. Right? So we will go eventually to this idea that we need to reinvent this space of theory and praxis, reinvent and get rid of words like emancipation, which were, of course, so foundational to critical theory. Latour is really an urgent call for us now, here, in the face of climatic Armageddon, to rethink politics and rethink praxis. So we'll get there, to the present, shortly. But we're going to start first at the Institute, at Columbia as well, with Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse on the deep tension between theory and practice. Such a deep tension between those two Aristotelian modes of being, of living a virtuous life, and also a deep tension between, on the one hand, Adorno and Horkheimer, and on the other hand, Marcuse. So, a deep tension within the Frankfurt School. I posted a short introduction on this question on the Praxis 1313 website, where I characterize the tension as one between a dialectic and a unity. Right. On the one hand, with Adorno and Horkheimer, we are told there is a dialectic of theory and praxis that ultimately tilts sharply, in truth, towards theory, if one has to be honest. On the other hand, with Marcuse, using similar language as dialectic, he ends up tilting sharply in the other direction, towards radical revolutionary practice, supportive of and inspired, and inspiring too, the student movement. I was struck by this again from rereading different passages. So let me just start here, just with two passages, and then maybe I'll turn it over to you, Martin, to flesh some of this out. So the first passage comes from Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason. As he himself says, he's actually channeling Adorno as well. There's a beautiful little passage here, actually. In terms of the only unity that there is here is the unity of Horkheimer and Adorno, actually, not of theory and praxis. He says, it would be difficult to say which of the ideas originated in Adorno's mind and which in my mind, our philosophy is one. So there's some unity here, but what's clear is that there isn't unity of theory and praxis. Now, returning to the Eclipse of Reason, there's a reason for that also, is that it was written in 1946, which was a different time. Because I don't want us to necessarily think that Adorno's position on the relationship between theory and praxis was just a reaction to the student movements from '68 and the way in which they were interacting with Adorno. I think we often, in looking back, we think that kind of his Marginalia to theory and praxis might have been a reaction to the confrontation by students in '68, pushing him in a particular direction. But I think if you look closely at an earlier iteration of the Frankfurt School, post-World War II, you actually see the same position. So in Eclipse and Reason 46, Horkheimer, of course, situates himself in the post-World War II moment. Democratic regimes, he's saying, the regimes that victoriously ended the war alongside the Soviet Union, confronted a veritable crisis, as technical progress and knowledge was accompanied by mass manipulation and what he called a process of dehumanization. Horkheimer was deeply concerned that the ambition of liberal democracy, what he calls the idea of man, or maybe the ambition of democracy, or an ambition at that time, would succumb, and that we might, in the West, face a resurgence of totalitarianism and fascism. And I have to say, rereading some of these passages are particularly frightening today. This passage, for instance, where he writes, whether this situation is a necessary phase in the general ascent of society as a whole, or whether it will lead to a victorious re-emergence of the neo-barbarism recently defeated in the battlefields, depends on what we do. And of course, reading that today, as I was just reading Le Monde on my way here, reading the articles about what's happening under the extreme right chancellor in Austria, or under Viktor Orban in Hungary, or to think about Donald Trump in the United States, or what's happening in Brazil, is chilling and actualizes this text in a way that is frightening. Now, right there, though, what's interesting is that what Horkheimer says is that the only way to overcome the risk of the ascent of fascism, basically, depends on our ability to interpret accurately the profound changes now taking place in the public mind and in human nature, right? And notice, It's our ability to interpret accurately, to interpret, right? We are in the realm of theoria. We're in the contemplative, faced with the crisis of democratic disillusionment, what he calls dehumanization, faced with what we face today, the looming rise of the extreme right. Horkheimer calls for interpretation. Not only that, but he goes further in the next paragraph, essentially foreshadowing Adorno's Marginalia. His goal, he says, is to throw some light on the philosophical implications of these changes. And he writes, it's not, he writes, in doing so, the author himself is not trying to suggest anything like a program of action, right? On the contrary, he believes, Horkheimer's using the third person, so Horkheimer believes that the modern propensity to translate every idea into action or into active abstinence from action is one of the symptoms of the present cultural crisis. Action for action's sake is in no way superior to thought for thought's sake and is perhaps even inferior to it. As understood in practice in our civilization, progressive rationalization tends, in my opinion, to obliterate that very substance of reason in the name of which this progress is espoused. Right? And so you see here in 46, in Horkheimer's voice, really the position that Marcuse would stake out years later in Marginalia on Praxis and Theory. Never, of course, advocating theory for theory's sake, but resisting, right? Resisting the move to a program, resisting the move to praxis. Now, of course, one can hardly think of a further position from this than Marcuse's, who, of course, himself never advocates action for action's sake, and who also embraces a vision of a dialectic of theory and practice, but nevertheless spells out a programmatic vision and inspires others to action. And so it's in the passages that we read today from One-Dimensional Man that you feel this well in the section on alternatives. There's a clear program and ways to measure its success. Marcuse calls for the pacification of existence, is his key term, I would say, and he tells us what we will need to sacrifice, those of us who live in affluent societies, and how we can measure progress. You can hear the program well at the bottom of the English edition at page 242, the refusal of all toughness and brutality, disobedience, refusal, protest, right? And of course this notion of the great protest, which was so closely associated with Marcuse. For Marcuse, as he writes in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, right, the most advanced counterforce, so the most promising counterforce, he says, is the radical student movement. And as he writes, the protest against these conditions must become a political weapon. So those are, in some sense, I mean, so we start here then with these works and with these two poles, both of which are trying to develop a dialectic, but both of which seem to be going in very different directions. So I wanted to just start there, perhaps, and turn it over to you, Martin, to get your thoughts on how we should think about the dialectic or the unity of theory and practice in the middle and late works of the Frankfurt School.
Yes, thank you, Bernard. And again, welcome to the Institute, and thank you for the Institute for hosting us in this symbolic space, and of course, welcome to everyone at their respective screens. So, for sure, the relationship between theory and practice is a vintage critical theory theme, and the two texts we selected are in a way classical sites for exactly that question. And let me just walk you through these two texts again, a little bit with a close attention to some of the tropes and some of the metaphors and some of the phrasings, just to see how these two authors, in a way, the two classical ones on these questions, try to formulate that problem of a theory and practice relationship. And maybe we could start at least with that assertion. For these authors, this is a problem, a problematic that is not solved, And there's probably nowhere in these texts the certainty that one should have or could have a clear grip of that relationship, but that it should remain problematic or problematic to think about. And it might even be that that's the very point of this intervention. And I guess that in the second half of our discussion today, we will try to ask whether Latour is open to leaving the relationship between theory and practice as open as these two authors do it, or whether there is not something more spontaneous and more rigorous and maybe even problematic in his turn to practice. So let's start with the 1968 text of Adorno's Die Marginalien zur Theorie und Praxis. And as you have all seen it, when you have read the text, you see that he's pretty clear in stating the thesis, which is a thesis about the problematic, the, let's say, dumbness of confusing the two. And he states it pretty straightforwardly right in the beginning. The antithesis of theory and practice is abused if it is used to denounce theory. And this is right at the beginning of section 3, which just means that Adorno is writing, and this of course has to do with some of the historical developments between 67 and 68, but it has a much broader historical horizon, as Bernard was pointing out. This points to the fact that sometimes pointing to a too close relationship between theory and practice means to denounce theory and denounce the contemplative or the reflective or the intellectual or, let's say, the academic. And this is exactly what was happening, at least sometimes, between, let's say, early 60s and late 60s. And Adorno, from the very beginning of this text, is taking a distance from these too simplistic or too closely seen relationship between the two, or an easy, and he would probably say, unmediated transition from theory to practice. And he even says, and that's an interesting formulation, there is something indefinitely progressive in the separation of theory and practice. And this is right at the beginning of section 5. What does this mean? He seems to say that insisting on the separateness of theory at least leaves a realm that is not, let's say, consumed by practice and by the urgencies of practical life or practical action. And therefore, theory can be a residue that can have a resisting function or force, and therefore collapsing the two will be at the cost of theory. And he says, more often than not, calling for an immediate transition from theory to practice means that one doesn't want to bother with questions, doubts, and uncertainties. And therefore, it makes sense to hold on to, let's say, the relative autonomy of theory, even against the urge to act immediately. Aktionismus ist regressiv is a sentence from the beginning of section 11. And I guess it's translated as action for action's sake is regressive, or as he calls it, Praktizismus, also a word hard to translate because practicism probably is not what you would expect this to be in English, can become ideology. This is section 13. And this refers to the very fact that some political actors are trying to replace reflective, theoreticized, intellectualized forms of action with spontaneous action proper. And this, of course, also is a theme from the history of Marxism, trying, let's say, to combat left deviation. And therefore, and this is again the thesis he was trying to advance from the beginning in section 14, he says, the relationship between theory and practice has to be one of discontinuity, and he goes on, it has to be one of what he calls the qualitativer Umschlag, so the qualitative transformation or turn, and no transition, no Übergang. And this is the set of formulations that point too closely to what Bernard already has said. The schema in which he sets up this dichotomy or this antithesis is, of course, dialectical one, but this means that theory refers to practice as practice refers to theory. Dialectics means interconnectedness or mutual interconnectedness, but it also means that each of the two poles has a separate, relative autonomous function or role. And therefore, to collapse a dialectical relationship means to think undialectically. And therefore, and that's another sentence, another phrase from right the end of the article, practice is the source of theory, the motor, and not its recommendation. Therefore, the whole text is insisting on the not collapsing, not confounding, not merging or fusing theory and practice, because theory can be a counterpoint, a counterpart. It can inform practice without becoming practice, as practice can be something like the goal, the aim of every theory without replacing it. And that's, let's say, Adorno's suggestion in '68, where many people were trying to replace every form of academic activity, reflection and so on, with spontaneous and concerted action. He says there must be room, even within a progressive political movement, for, let's say, reflection, doubt, self-reflexivity, self-criticism, and every attempt to fuse this with action proper is Praktizismus or Aktionismus, and therefore a huge problem. So we could, just to sum up, say his suggestion is that there is no easy relation, no unmediated relation between the two, but there is and has to be a dialectic. A dialectic will involve poles or separate, relatively autonomous parts or spheres of the relation. There is something like a relative autonomy of the two spheres, and theory cannot be translated into practice completely, even if it might connect to practice or inform practice and the other way around. And therefore, it's the goal or the task or the responsibility of the thinking intellectual to resist all too easy solutions and to resist collapsing into action for action's sake or Aktionismus. And this, Bernard is right, one should not overstate the biographical, contextual side of this, but one should also not underestimate it, because these texts and the famous reflection on resignation, also from '68, is probably the twin piece to this one. This is also Adorno trying to get to grips with his own historical role in the midst of, let's say, quasi or even full, complete revolution. Marcuse and One-Dimensional Man is from '64 in the English original, has a similar point, also interestingly already at that time had a similar function in a pretty spontaneous and also pretty violent militant political movement. He makes a similar point, but as you saw, and Bernard was also pointing to that already, he really proposes something like a counterpoint to this, but it's starting quite similarly. Marcuse says a certain rationality is the problem. So Marcuse is subscribing to the Horkheimerian framework here. And he seems to say that a vision of a society fulfilling its needs with technological means alone, within the bounds of a capitalist economy and a more or less liberal state, is insufficient. And everyone who diagnoses this situation in '64, '63, '62, will come to more or less the same conclusion if he or she is honest. And what he says is, we need something else, because in this system, a specific state system, a specific technology and science system, and of course a specific economic system, the real needs, the Bedürfnisse, are neglected. The bodily and sensual aspects are systematically repressed. And therefore, society in this very phase cannot fulfill its own potentials. And therefore, we need something that Marcuse in this text and in many, many other texts calls liberation, namely a real politics of real needs that is in the service of, and he quotes Whitehead here, an art of living. Therefore, the lebensfeindliche, anti-life tendency of capitalism cum liberal democracy has to be replaced, or at least has to be confronted by a contestation, a provocation, a scandalization, coming from theory, coming from a social diagnosis, coming from a social theory or Gesellschaftsdiagnose, that points to the bodily, sensual, the need-oriented aspects of this very system, and pointing to the fact that within the current system, the real human potential of mankind will not be realizable, and therefore there will be another role of the body, of the fantasies, and also the drives, and only a specific kind of theoretical imagination can try to think about and fantasize about these other forms of social organization in which the bodily needs, but also the human potentials unfulfilled in common society could be fully realized. Maybe the most interesting, one of the most interesting parts of this text comes on the very last pages, when Marcuse here is reflecting on the question, who might bring this change about? And interestingly, in this text, at least from 64, the answer is not, as he later gave it, the student movement. But the answer is different. Interestingly enough, he says it could only be imaginable that people that are not already fully in the system as it is installed, who might be the bearers, the actors, the subjects of these transformations. And this is on the penultimate page, where he points to the excluded, the marginalized. That means it will not be the working class, but these other subjects, the marginalized, excluded, we might even say today with Gramsci and others, the subaltern subjects, who might be the new revolutionary subject, because they are not already part of and co-opted into the many niceties and the many satisfactions of that system, which the system, of course, already grants, because it's an affluent society of abundance, as he says. But he seems to say only people not fully integrated at this very moment in this historical context might be the ones who might develop new sensibilities and new sensitivities that might lead to new theories, new sciences, and a new politics. As I said, a politics geared towards the realization of real and authentic needs and the realization of, let's say, authentic wishes and potentials of humanity. And this will need a new subject. And in this text, at least, in this very end passages, he seems to say that might not be fully an intellectual or theoretical question, and this is different from some of the later texts, but he seems to say you have to be in a specific social position of non-co-optedness, of non-integration, from which such a potential for re-envisioning the political system and its very political forms might be possible. Therefore, in comparison to Adorno, you're right, there's more unity, there's more fusion of theory and practice, but he also seems to say it could be that transformation comes from a side where the theorists, the intellectuals, us, let's say, don't expect it. It might be a position from outside, from the margins, that might only create, first, the motivation, but second, also the capacities, and mainly the capacity to envision or fantasize or project an alternative that is badly needed and that maybe cannot come from inside. And this, for me, is a point of entry also into the Latour text, because he also has quite interesting, and I would say, at least on a first stage, heterodox ideas about who might be the new revolutionary subject, or, to put it more simply, the new subject of social and political transformation. And in this text, at least, Marcuse seems to say, well, we need a diagnosis, we need a social theory, but since the theories as we have them are also part of the problem, are corrupt in a way, we might and should be open to impulses and also propositions, proposals from actors that have not been part of the theoretical, intellectual, and academic discussions that might come from outside the margins, or at least might be in contact also with some of the outsides of this system that as a system is a problem that has to be faced. And therefore, two Frankfurt School, two critical theory positions. One insisting on the relative autonomy of theory as a resistant attitude against all too easy practicism, action for action's sake, and an insistence on the dialectical relation that has to be kept open and that must not be subsumed by spontaneous action alone. I would love to have Adorno comment on situationism and Debord and the French contemporaries, but alas, he never did. On the other side, Marcuse also insisting that this new historical phase will need new theories. And of course, he takes himself and others to be the ones apt and capable to provide these. But on the other hand, he's more skeptical, and he allows for the fact that sometimes there must be something like, not a priority of practice, but a contextual advantage or primacy of some actors in that they are not already fully integrated into a system that is not only a political and economic system, but also a system of thought, of thinking. And this is where Marcuse sometimes sounds a little bit esoteric when he seems to point to other rationalities or thought outside of the confines of scientific reason. But his point is, I think, clear and I would say provocative and interesting, pointing to actors, subjects, that might become part of the debate that they haven't been part of yet, because what they did and what they said, what they articulated, didn't fit the grid of intelligibility or sayability or public discourse, let's say. And therefore there's more like a fusion, or at least there's a gesture towards, let's say, a narrowing of the gap between theory and practice, sometimes even the suggestion of, let's say, an Aufhebung, cancellation of the very separateness between the two. But he knows, and he writes, I think, hesitantly, that it's hard to talk about this without giving the voice to these very subjects, but speaking for them. And this is, of course, a problematic, dear to other thinkers as well. And since it's dear to Foucault, it's also dear to Bernard and me, that it's sometimes peinlich to speak for others. And this is also something Marcuse at that time, who was later taken to be the one speaking for many, many others, also in a way felt, and in a way was just noting down here as a way of intellectual honesty that this revolution will not come from the professors, let's say.
So that was marvelous and a good, an amazing way to put them in conversation and to get our conversation going as well. And I think I want to pick up on three aspects of what you were suggesting. Because I'm particularly intrigued by this idea of seeking the praxis outside, which in part is what you're suggesting with at least the ending of One-Dimensional Man. And so what that raises to me are three issues that I thought we could put on the table and start talking about. The first is, so if there is this dialectical tension, right, the question that comes up really is, are we simply dealing with, so what is that? What is dialectical about this tension, right? Are we simply dealing with two places on a pole where we should be going back and forth, and that each should inform the other, which is, I think, a correct way to think about it? Or is there something more than that? And here, I think we could bring in Foucault, who both you and I have spent a lot of time thinking about, and particularly his relationship, his at some point I called it a dialectical relationship between theory and praxis, because there's no doubt that for Foucault, the theoretical work from the late 1960s, which was a turn towards understanding discourses, was formative and shaped his practical intervention, for instance, with the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, the prisons information group that he and others founded in 71 and worked on for a couple of years. In the sense that he was originally tasked with having a popular tribunal and engaging in a form of activity that would have been very much him speaking on behalf of other people. And he agreed to participate, but he wanted to push it in a completely different direction, which was to create a groupe d'information in which the prisoners would speak for themselves. And there's no doubt that that practice was infused, shaped by his theory. Right? And so you have that movement. And there's also no doubt, I mean, and that movement in many other ways as well, there's also no doubt that the practice itself then came back and shaped his theory and significantly affected the writing of Discipline and Punish, which comes out in 75. A couple of years later, he in fact says so explicitly in the text, right, saying this was shaped more than anything by my interventions. And you can hear it, for instance, when he walks out of Attica in 72 and says, you know, all of this experience has given me the idea that we have to reject the idea of repression. It's not just a repressive apparatus, it's a productive apparatus. The prison is producing something. And of course, what it becomes is it's producing docile bodies. Now, so you see the flow back, right? So you've got a back and forth. You have theory that's informing practice, shaping it, changing it. You have practice that's informing theory, changing it. And you have a constant tension, right? But the question I would have is there something more in the term dialectical than a tension and a mutual shaping? So that would be one question. I mean, sometimes when some philosophers speak of dialectical, they think of some way in which there's a movement beyond that, and I'm not sure whether Adorno thought that there would be some movement beyond that, or even if that was a way in which he was thinking. Now, the second question goes to this issue of that you raised, really, of an outside actor, a third party, creating a practice, say, from which intellectuals could then derive theory or be affected or shaped, which I think is very integral to the notion of a dialectic of theory and practice. I mean, I think that is the idea that somehow we could have theoretically informed work that is driven by new practices. And I think we think that today. We think today that the Occupy movement, or actually the Gilets jaunes right now, the ongoing movement in France, should shape our theory, right? And there would be an instance, certainly, of a kind of an exterior actors, right, at the rond-point all over France, somehow, not, intellectuals, not classic academics, shaping what we might think about in terms of theory. Now, does that mean, right, that when Horkheimer and Adorno kind of resist the practical program, that the theoretician somehow should not be involved in those formulations of practices, should not get their hands dirty? Is there a question of not getting your hands dirty here? And sometimes I feel as if that is part of the resistance, the theoretical, philosophical resistance to practice and to praxis is this fear of getting your hands dirty, in the sense that it's always, I mean, I think as theoreticians, it's always those moments when you've proposed something that I know for myself that I look back on it and I think, oh boy, I wish I hadn't done that. I mean, everything else was okay. All the theory was good, but that idea of, whatever, randomized punishment or something, which I still believe in. But it's just like, maybe I should have just not gone that far, right? And it's a question of what? It's that our skill as critical theorists is always to figure out how our proposals have gone off track, right? I mean, that's how humanism turns against itself, how liberal projects end up, or neoliberal projects end up enslaving the individual. So, I mean, what we're most skilled at, I take it, as theoreticians, is figuring out how things backfire. And so the second point is, so does that mean that in this, if there is this tension, so do we then say, well, we as theorists are going to keep our hands clean, let others engage in practice, and then we will theorize that practice, and it will inform our theory, very possibly. But what about the necessity or responsibility or need for the theoretician to propose or act herself? Yeah. I find it stunning in Marginalia when Adorno says that the dialectic of enlightenment, with its many which was heterodox theory of domination, was written without practical intentions. Right? I mean, that's even more than I'm not giving a program. That's saying I wasn't even thinking of it having a practical effect, possibly, but then he says, and nonetheless it exercised some practical influence. Maybe there's something wrong with the translation. It would be important to look at that. It's obviously in section 14, in the first full well, is it intentions? Yeah? 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 Yeah, okay. That's kind of stunning, of course, because that's even, I mean, it's okay for him to say that Marx had no program for action in Capital. Well, I mean, it would be okay for someone to say that they don't have a program for action in their work, but no practical intention. That's odd. That's odd. But anyway, it's still all the second question of, is it that we're trying to be too pure or protect ourselves? Which goes to the third point, which is that, yeah, we do protect ourselves often because these practical programs, they end up sounding ridiculous often. They really do. I don't know if you saw in One Dimensional Man, he has a Malthusian part of it, right? Where he basically, he sounds like Malthus. I mean, he's basically saying there are too many. This is page 243 of the old American edition. It presupposes a reduction in the future population, right? So, I mean, we're back to, the one-child program here, right? Now, looking back, now, maybe that's right. And we'll see, particularly when we turn to Bruno Latour and the problem of climate. Maybe that's right, but it's jarring to go back to that, and it's so jarring, and that's why, in part, there's often a privileging within our own disciplines and our own milieus and our own communities of the pristine theoretical over the applied, right? That's the third dimension, which is, do we as theorists try not just to keep our hands clean, but also to achieve a certain status and respectability by remaining at this level of a theoretical complexity that will survive in time. It's got a longer shelf life. Hegel's going to have a longer shelf life because then
Martin,
yes, right?
politician,
Yeah, right. because we can just continue to think about it in a way in which it doesn't have a historically situated dimension. That means it's going to be exhausted in the way history is working right now, probably tomorrow, right? I mean, actually, I mean, with the cycle now, which is I take it on a daily cycle. I mean, you know, whatever we would come up with programmatically would probably be outdated next week, right? So those are three. So those are three kind of topics, I think, that we might want to think about. I don't know if you want to reflect some. We should open it up as well. I can pass the mic to anyone who.
Yeah, let me just address the issues that are, of course, interconnected briefly. If we take the Orthodox Hegelian line, which we must not do always, but in this case, I think Adorno is insisting on playing the Hegelian card. A dialectical relationship means, in the very strong sense, that one side of the dialectics will be the other to the other side. And that sounds just more like a language game, but there's a serious, I think, implication in this, which is something he wants to capitalize on. As a dialectician, one has to accept that from the perspective of theory or from the perspective of practice, respectively, the other side is really other, alter. Because this is what a dialectic means. It's not just that things are different and then they come together and then they can, and you were using all the same metaphors as I was using them, flowing back and forth, informing, affecting, and shaping. That's definitely true. This is the interactive side, let's say, of a dialectic. And a dialectical relationship is one of mutual dynamics, and this will be back and forth, informing, shaping, etc. Affecting is the metaphor I like best as a Spinicist. But there's more. So the Hegelian line means one has to see that on one pole of the relationship, the other is reflected as its inverted negative side. So it's a logical schema. And this, for Adorno, means one should accept the fact that even while theory can inform practice and the other way around, there remains a side of it, a dimension of it, an aspect of it, that will remain unassimilable to the other side. So there's something alien in theory for practice and the other way around. And as you said in your third comment, one could interpret this, let's say, psychologically. This is a theorist not daring, or even the second part was hinting at that, a theorist not daring to make his hands dirty or not daring to make a quick and dirty suggestion that might be untimely the next day. And that's definitely true, those aspects are there. But for Adorno, this is a serious, almost logical point. One has to accept that reflecting on something in the terms or in the register of theory is, on one plane, completely different than reflecting on the same issue, the same problem, the same problematics in a practical Absicht or in a practical vein or in the register of practice. And this is now the interesting part, and this is good so. So this is a good way for things to be, that theory and practice don't have to fuse or merge, but they can be foreign to each other. And in a metaphor also dear to Foucault, we might even say one is inciting, provoking the other side by being its other or by being completely different. And I think this is something he thought at the end of the 60s, in a way, let's say, vanishing as an insight that at least was contained in classical dialectical philosophy, that sometimes practice needs the provocation of its complete other in pure reflection, pure contemplation. And he thought of himself, I think, as someone trying to play that part, because he saw that the political actors of the time, mainly his own students and Karl and the SDS, in a way had not crushed, but minimized that aspect of theoretical work within a political movement that in a way should have some passion and also some time for these more reflective non-absichtsvolle, non-practicist forms of reflection and intentions. And whether we buy this or not, and whether we buy the Hegelian schema or calculus at all, I think it's interesting to think of the fact that philosophy or theory or intellectual reflection might have a function that is not just a function for practice, but a function vis-a-vis practice, by being its other, being its counterpart, being its opposite. And as we recall, by the way, the very late Foucault had a similar idea about the construction or the relationship between politics and philosophy in the Greek context, where he said exactly that philosophy is related to politics, but is not politics, is in a way the productive and so the interesting and creative side of it. And therefore I would think here, I would not criticize Adorno for thinking this. I would criticize maybe some implications this might have if we see it in a certain way or so. But I think Adorno was insisting on the fact that the one being the other to and the other of, the first pole can have a function that is beyond a mere function or an instrumentality. Therefore, on the second point, it's true, this is not the model of engagement or being engaged as a theoretician, but it's more having a place, having a function, having a status of reflection, of slowing down, of self-criticism, where the political actors in this very same movement at the very same time have no time for this. But Adorno seems to say there has to be time for this, even if there is no time for this. And therefore philosophy will not merge into the movement. He's not Gramsci after all. But it will be in solidarity with and part of a movement, but as a theoretical or philosophical position or figure in that sense. And also that is something I would like us to retain as a distinctive model of the theory-practice relationship that's a little bit less activist than other models, but it insists on the relationship between the two, but also on the separateness or the alterity, let's say. And on the third point, yes, it's true. Marcuse is more eager to go there in terms of applications, suggestions, and fantasies. But for me, the very last pages of the essay don't contradict the other one, but in a way relativize it. But in the end, he says, who are we to say this? Who are we to claim that we could formulate a radical criticism or critique of the current system, since we are all part of it? This was a tenured professor, after all. We should not forget that. And therefore, he seems to say it will now also depend on subject positions and positionalities and on experiences. And it could be that a certain base of experiences of exclusion and marginality might be indispensable, not only politically to form a radical movement, but might also be indispensable epistemically. It might be that the good ideas also come from not outside or the outside, but come from the margin of what are the others already think and from which they have so far not drawn any militant consequences. And also that seems to me a good way of looking at it. And I see the slight difference to Adorno, but still for me it also retains something of the alterity moment or the non-unity or the non-fusion moment in this still tensionful relationship between theory and practice.
Yeah, and I definitely agree that with Foucault you saw that same instinct as Marcuse, which was to not speak for others. And I think at this point in time, I'm not sure when that became dominant. So I'm not sure when that self-reflection became such a mainstream part of political thought as it is today. But it's clear that this notion of not speaking for others is central, I think, today to most movements on the left. Certainly to Black Lives Matter, certainly to hashtag #MeToo. The idea, I mean, there are still those who speak of vanguardism, Zizek sometimes. I mean, so it's not as if it's completely disappeared, but I would say within most contemporary political movements, there is a resistance to speaking for others that has an enormous effect on the theory-practice relationship. I think you saw it perfectly recently with the Gilets jaunes, the fact that this is a leaderless group. Every time anyone came forward to say something or to claim in some way to be representative or to be a spokesperson or to they were immediately discarded, because the point is there isn't anyone who's going to be able to speak for this group. And surely, I mean, that has become now, but the question then becomes, how does that affect the relationship between theory and practice? I think it does in an important way, meaning that it becomes even more, I mean, it would no longer even be, maybe no longer even possible to throw out a program or to be programmatic in the way it might have been earlier, because of these issues of representation and where the proposal is coming from. So I think that is a huge looming issue that in part comes out of here, that comes out of this very tension. Although I don't get a sense that was the Adorno-Horkheimer hesitation. I don't think that it was a hesitation of, I don't think we should speak for others, right? There was a different resistance going on there. But today, I don't think that we can speak about the dialectic between theory and practice without having in mind very much of the Foucauldian and other sensibility to these questions of discourse. Who's speaking, who's being heard, who's not being heard, which complicates things, I think.
And when we turn to Latour, we will of course start with this point, because he has this enormously interesting way of posing this question anew, because he has this other sense of who might be one who might have a say or speaking. But should we have a round, if someone wants to come in, at least let's say now, more focused on the Marcuse Adorno text, and we'll open the discussion with the new references to the
My name is Gianluca Cavallo, and I found the discussion very interesting, and I have some remarks. I think the dialectic between theory and praxis is also to think in this way, that as Adorno says, theory itself is a kind of praxis, in the sense that it's a way of resistance against, I don't know, the usual ways of thinking or against the way things are thought about. And in this sense, I think it's also easier to understand what it means not to make one's hand dirty for a theorist. That if your hands become too dirty, then your thought cannot be resistance anymore, because then you are too involved, and then you cannot see the things from outside and maintain this kind of freedom that is fundamental for the intellectual viewpoint, I would say. But there is a question that I think it would be important to discuss for us today, that I pose to looking at the text that you quoted before, when Adorno says, we didn't write those texts with a practical intention, but they had a practical they had some practical effects. Could we say the same for philosophical texts today? I mean, if we think of the effects that Marcuse's text had at that time, we see that there was a relationship between theory and praxis, however defined. Is there anything like that today?
So that's a question for all of us.
Yes.
Who else would like
it? I'm Stefan, and I think, so you were asking, is there anything more than tension in dialectics, or than this more like formal movement in a certain way? And I think, and that's also important for the difference between Adorno's and Marcuse's position, there is, and it's a suspicious category, and that's history. So I would say that the difference between their positions is how they relate to history, or how they relate what Adorno would probably call the object. So to me it seems like Adorno's reflections, especially in the Marginalien, are reflections upon a historical disintegration of theory and practice. So he's referring back to like several attempts, losses, events within the history of emancipatory movements, maybe. He's referring back to the Paris Commune, he's referring back to Marx, he's referring back to the 20s and the 30s. And the categories he's developing to analyze the problem of theory and practice stem from this history. So, for example, when he's talking about anti-authoritarianism, he's talking about anarchism. Of course, he does that in Resignation, for example, where he says the rise of anarchy is sort of like it's a ghost. So these are historical reflections, I would say. Whereas in Marcuse, it seems to me that, and that's also in the letters between Adorno and Marcuse, for Marcuse, he has a much more voluntarist approach, if you might say so. So the main, I think his main argument, and that's also what Adorno like writes him, is Marcuse's main argument for the practice of like this student movement is that it's an unbearable situation, that it's like subjectively unbearable to I don't know, to see the suffering in the world, to see the Vietnam War, to see like the war in third world countries, and so on and so on. So Marcuse's position would rather be, in a certain way, I would say, anarchist. Like he's impatient in a certain way, and I think, according to the category of history, we can sort of like determine their difference, because to me it seems Adorno, he has this, I mean, it's his philosophical conception as well, right? Vorrang des Objekts. So it's the priority of the object. Whereas in Marcuse, to me it seems it's like priority of the subject in a certain way. Also, when you say he's sort of like esoteric, he's talking about like the, maybe certain like capacities, forces, and so on that subjects have, and I think the position of Marcuse, and then I'm finished after that sentence, is somewhat reflected by Adorno as well, especially in his reflections on Kant and Hegel in Marginalia, where he's talking about the sort of like the disintegration of these two aspects, so the individual, the Besondere, and the universal, das Allgemeine in Hegel. And so I think it's, so Marcuse's position is already like reflected within Adorno's thinking in a certain way.
Do you want to address the first and I'll the second?
Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay. So, so the question that you pose: is there any practical effect to philosophical interventions today? Right? Is the question? Yeah.
And
yeah.
probably should we aspire to have them?
And should we aspire to have them? Should there be intentionality? So, should there be intentionality? Are there effects? And
effects without intentionality?
Yeah, are there effects without intentionality? So so the answer is that there are clearly effects, often even unintentional effects, and often misconstrued effects, and often diversions of intentionality. I think the prime examples here would be thinkers like Foucault or Latour himself, right? And in fact, this text that we will turn to next is almost a defense against, and a lot of the work that Bruno Latour is doing right now, including the performance work that he's doing, is very much of a defense against what he considers to be the misunderstanding of his philosophical contribution on the question of truth, right? And of course, so much of the contemporary conversation about Foucault on truth is a conversation about, is a question of, is he and others, are they responsible for our post-truth reality today, right? I have a strong opinion about that. The answer is no, but those are implications, and they may be kind of the unintended implications, unintended consequences. Certainly, I have an answer to the question: was Foucault intervening politically? Did he have intentions? I will say that's a clear yes, although they were never formulated. They were never formulated explicitly. They were never on the page, but he was always in conversation with someone politically. He was always in conversation. I mean, in the years that I've spent, the period that I have spent the most time editing his work, which is 71 to 75. I mean, he was in conversation with Althusser so vividly in those texts. He's not saying it. He's not pointing to Althusser. He's not explicitly responding, but he's picking up on particular terms, for instance, and you can actually see it in La Société Punitive. You can see him use particular terms that he is explicitly drawing on Althusser to flip against Althusser. Okay, notions of appareil d'état, etc. You can hear it, you can see it, and actually, there's a beautiful exchange with Étienne Balibar in one of those volumes. I think it was in Théorie Institution Pénale, where there's this kind of way in which the conversation was. So I think that there was actually intention there, and I certainly think that Latour's early work. I mean, I was rereading La Vie de the Laboratory Life, the early work from '79. There were direct intentions in terms of ethnographic interventions and what he was trying to do that had a strong political dimension, and this text as well. So I think that the answer is yes. I think that but I think that it gets veiled most often at the highest levels, precisely because that aspect of the philosophical work has less status, and also out of a fear that it will have less of an effect in some way, that it will be too grounded in a particular debate, too grounded in a particular historical context, for the intervention to then be able to be useful at some other time in some other context, right? And so oftentimes I think, in a way this is a little bit reading texts in a Straussian way, but that you can read between the lines and you can see exactly who the person is aiming at, and what is the kind of silent, coded conversation that's going on, but that's nevertheless giving birth to a text that then will be able to have ramifications over the long term. So that's a quick. Actually, that's probably too long of a response, but we'll continue that conversation, I think, with Latour.
Let me just get back to this one, obviously now a little bit controversial formulation. The works were written without practical intent or intention, but nonetheless had some practical effect. That's the sentence. So not written in practical intent or intention here means without the pragmatic statement, without the proposal of something to do. And this is definitely right. Consider the Dialectics of Enlightenment. Nobody knows what one should do after reading this. And this here means there are texts that are written, of course, with something in view, namely the return of barbarity. Something that is, of course, criticized and denounced. Therefore, it's normatively through and through. But it doesn't have, in this sense, a practical intention that it comes with a recipe, a therapy, or a constructive proposal. And that it had some practical effect, of course, means that many people reading this made up their own minds what you could do if this diagnosis is true, or at least hits something. And he's quite, in this formulation, quite proud of this. He's quite proud of having written a text that has some practical effect. But he insists on the fact that the texts themselves, the theoretical, writerly work, didn't contain, in that sense, the practical intention of a programmatic, of something to do, of a proposal. And our friend Foucault said the same thing. He said, I don't write books to teach anyone anything about what he or she should do. Right. And in that sense, the practical intention is narrowly understood, like the constructive programmatic side.
But intention is, are you sure that it's not, that he was saying is that
intention. It's
no practical
Absicht.
So it, because I mean that has a slight, there's just a slight valence difference possibility about, with no intention to give a program, or or could it be there's no intention, it wasn't intended to stimulate practical response. It wasn't intended to stimulate a practical response. It wasn't intended to have
practical response.
Well, it wasn't that it wasn't suggesting, it wasn't giving a program. Right. That's clear. It's not giving a program. But there's a difference between an intention not to give a program versus an intention not to have practical effect. And that's the question.
Yeah, and I would say it's only the first.
It's only the first.
He wants to say, because what the effects might be is non-derivable, non-deducible, let's say, from the diagnosis or the critique or the perspective raised or given. But you're right. So the very term ohne praktische Absicht might not really give that away, that it's meant like this. But I think it's pretty clear, because consider, it's not only the dialectic of enlightenment, he says about the authoritarian personality, written without practical intent. It only means this is a diagnosis, a social analysis, Sozialforschung, after all, that in itself has no, let's say, practical part, in that it's proposing now therapies, policies, things to do. But of course it's practical through and through, but through its possible effects. But this will be effects channeled through the intentions of practical political subjects. And this is not what the work itself contains. And the famous metaphor about the, what's the Flaschenpost? The bottle, the message in a bottle? You remember that? This is Horkheimer and Adorno's metaphor, what they tried to do in 41 when they finished the Dialectics of Enlightenment. This was not a message intended to a specific audience or addressed to someone, but it was a message in a bottle thrown into the sea, and they knew it would come on shore sometime, but didn't know when and to whom it would be useful. So for me, this is the idea. Of course, this is practically intended, let's say, but not with a specific intention, a specific program, or a specific suggestion.
Before you move on to the before you move on to the second question, I liked the way you brought in Foucault there. It's interesting, of course, that there's these times where he says that Discipline and Punish, for instance, is written for, he has a long list, right? For the prison guard, and for the prisoner, and there's that interesting moment in which he seems to be saying, you know, it's not written for you theorists, or at least that's not the audience that I really want for this book, right? Who I really want are educators, right? It's written for educators. I think that's one of the terms he has in there. And by educators, I suppose what he means is school instructors, teachers, right? And of course, there is clear practical intentions to a certain extent, I think.
Sure,
something,
but then what is this book? It's a book about history. So, and if there is practical intent, it's also something, practical intention, practical programmatics. This is what any reader had to, let's say, emulate, take out of it, because it wasn't there, because the book is not saying a single sentence, do this or do that. And therefore there's also a play going on. This is a text, of course, thoroughly addressed to someone and thoroughly addressed to people who then might do some things. But the text itself doesn't contain its own conclusions or derivative programmatics.
No program.
Yeah.
Right, no program.
And therefore he might have said without practical intention, but with some practical effects, no?
Well, no, I mean, you know, this is my reading of Surveiller et Punir, but I mean, I think it was practically intended as a brutally sharp critique of liberalism at a time when, basically at a time when everybody was rightly criticizing the Soviet Union, right? But the whole idea of the archipelago of surveillance, right, was this reference to, you know, les archipels. That was a kind of signal to the critiques of Stalinism and communism, but that we were turning it back into our own liberal society. But of course, you know, but he could be unique as compared to others necessarily. I mean, you know.
So let's just to conclude this section or session or part of the discussion. So there might be 2 or 3 options, and now we are just disagreeing whether Foucault is in the first 2 or if he has a different one. So we might have the vanguardist position, theory informing and even strategically informing political action. And we might say, Marcuse sometimes comes close, but he also incorporates parts of the second position that insists on the non-unity, the discontinuity, as Adorno says, between theory and practice, and then insists on the productive effects that come out of the fusing, non-identity, non-collapsing of the two, and that insists on what I call the relative autonomy of the two poles, and also, of course, in that sense, the autonomy of theory. And we might have a third position that tries to be informative for and to actors, but leaves open their own conclusions from what is proposed to them, because it's not specific, not action guiding, but already written with this audience in view. And sometimes it sounds like Foucault is somewhere between the second and the third. And this would also have to be addressed, I think, with respect what we should call the methodology of Foucault's works. That, of course, is, since most of the works are historical, somehow different from a purely theoretical book that can be applied. So, but that would be another discussion. And I just wanted to say, because you brought in the history point, you're completely right, I think. And one should also think that Adorno in '68 is also addressing Marcuse and the Marcuse readers, of course. And I would think he was addressing it in the way we just laid out. He thought that Marcuse is too close to the first model, and it's somehow still vanguardist, and therefore practicist, as he would call it. This is too much trying to fuse with a current of political movement and action. And whether this is fair to Marcuse or not, I think is a question for intellectual and social movement historians.
Right. And then also I think we would need to distinguish historical periods within some of these authors too, right?
And context and national context.
Yeah. Okay, so that brings us then to, so we move forward from these classic debates and this classic tension between theory and praxis and this dialectic of theory and praxis, which is really born here in part, right, to at least one contemporary intervention, the very contemporary intervention of Bruno Latour in Down to Earth. Now, I had indexed at the start this passage where he seems to be suggesting that we just need to completely start again, map out new ways, new directions, discard all of the old ways in which we were even speaking, or discard this language, right, left, emancipation, etc. And just to set the stage, then, I think that one of the aspects that is so clear in this text is that he's doing that as a way to, well, I argue it's almost a form of penance for him. There's a sense in which he is writing as a well-established Frenchman from the upper class. He recognizes this. He prefaces his own final intervention on this, right? Where is he going to land on Earth, right? Well, he lands on Earth in part on the Latour property, which is one of the biggest wine merchants in Burgundy, right? But there is this, and as such, he is confessing as a European, I take it. He's confessing the errors of the European way, the domination, the colonization. He is confessing guilt for this and asking himself, but asking us to join him, perhaps, to join him in recognizing the errors of our ways and coming up with new ways to think about ourselves, our place on the earth, and what we have to do in order to make to have a second chance. He speaks specifically of a second chance on page 106, right? That he speaks specifically of a second chance that is in no way deserved, right? And many of the things that he's saying, actually, I mean, the connection to Marcuse, I think, is really fascinating, because Marcuse also had a very similar kind of feeling about affluent society, right? That affluent society was too affluent, that affluent society would have to give up a lot, right? He talks about it specifically, Marcuse, on 242. The standard of living attained in the most advanced industrial areas is not a suitable mode of development if the aim is pacification. And in many ways, there's a real overlap here, that we have to do things completely differently now. We have to do things completely differently. We have to assume responsibility for this, confess our guilt, and then lead by example. Now, that's kind of interesting in terms of leading by example. It's not as if Bruno Latour is necessarily saying here, I'm not going, that I'm going to, he's not stepping back in the way in which there is today very much of an idea of the need to step back and listen to other voices, right? He's saying, we need to, I need to, this is his personal statement, I need to lead by example. And of course, that would be very practice-oriented should he start to do that in a very meaningful way. But it would be personal acts that he would want others possibly to think about. Of course, this is an invitation for everyone to essentially explain where they are landing on Earth, and what they and how they are prepared to deal with this moment, which, as the book claims, is really apocalyptic on climate. So those are some of the connections. I will want to come back to this question of the role of truth. I think truth, the history of Latour on science, on the construction of facts, is very important to this. In part, it's because of that history that he takes this position, which is it's not going to be just a matter of telling people the facts, right? It's not getting more facts out there. It's not more CNN instead of Fox News, right? It's not a question of convincing people of facts at this point. We've gotten past that. We're at a point where that's not at play anymore. And I think that's really important, and in part, of course, it does have to do with these important questions about the effects of philosophical interventions. So I will want to come back to that and a few other things, but maybe let me turn it over to you, Martin.
Also, just to rehash some of the steps and some of the elements of this diagnosis, it's both a practical, political, real-world diagnosis. Things have gone wrong in a certain way. What we have come to call globalization is in a way a fateful development because it has deracinated, unrooted communities, lifestyles, and also technological options. But it's also accompanied by a problematic in the worldview, or in, let's say, the systems of thought we exercise or inhabit. So if there is a deep crisis that he diagnoses, it's a crisis of, let's say, the world and its development, and in the mindset, or crisis of the mindset we have come to inhabit so far. And this goes back to his earlier texts on we have never been modern, and the idea that we are in a way as moderns, even late moderns, tied to a specific, what he calls ontology, where they differentiate between human subjects and the rest of the world that appears as object to our desires and our technological manipulation. And he seems to say, and this for me also is a quasi-Marcusean moment, we have to change both. We have to change our ways in which we go about in this world that is not really a world, but only a globe in the way we try to objectify it. And we also have to find a different way of articulating, even sensing, our relations to the other entities and beings in the world. And this, of course, also harks back to his own theoretization within actor network theory of the agency or the agentiality of non-human beings and actors. And he seems to say some of the more recent ultra-problematic developments, like the rise or explosion, as he says, of inequality, the crisis that in a way are connected to many of the different migration movements, and the rise of populace and climate change denial are interconnected, that they both testify to certain interrelated social real-world developments, but they also testify to the limits of the worldview we had and the kind of attitude we were, in a way, inhabiting. No, that's not the right word, that we were embodying in our practical life, but also in how we were viewing things. And therefore, this crisis can only be combated on both levels. So there has to be a practical reorientation. This is what the word, I think, politics here stands for. But this manifesto, which it definitely is, also calls for a revision of categories and a revisioning of, let's say, our ontology, in which we differentiate between sensing and feeling and acting human subjects and a non-sensing, only objectified, only manipulable world of which animals, but also the non-animal part of nature, in a way, is populated. And therefore, he makes an interesting, also semantically, terminologically interesting suggestions. We need the terrestrial as a new political actor. This is in chapter 9, and there are a couple of schemata where he tries to set this up. This is a little bit, I think, a pun on some of the Lacanian work, if I see that right, but maybe he thinks it's serious. And the terrestrial is a pretty elusive term pointing to the connection between different ontological elements, pointing to context, pointing to locality, to habitat or resource. And he claims that globalization as a real-world social and political movement has done the opposite. It has not been rooted at, geared towards, oriented towards the terrestrial, but toward either the globe, which is the emptied out, let's say the hollow form of a goal of a world that is unified by technological means, or that is unified under common technological standards, or it has been oriented towards the extraterrestrial, as he calls it, which is, I think, a pun on E.T. and Hollywood, of course. But it's serious, because for him, Trump is the prime figure of a politics geared towards, oriented towards the extraterrestrial, which means a politics denying the real world which is local, contextual, a habitat for someone, and not just something you can put to worth or exploit. And therefore, what he seems to propose is reorienting politics, social action, but also reorienting thought or thinking, very Heideggerian movement, towards the earth, the terrestrial, which implies that the one doing the political acting and the one doing the thinking, the philosopher and the politicians, are also, of course, part of a habitat, part of a context, part of a locality, namely the terrestrial. And then, as in the case of Marcuse, things turn a little bit esoteric when there is the idea, how do you do that? How do you listen to these beings that are also sentient beings, sometimes not, organic, non-organic, that are part of this habitat and with whom we should live? And the term or the concept of cohabitation is quite interesting here. This is chapter 17 and 18, where he says we have not learned to inhabit our terrestrial space or place or context or habitat. Therefore, we think, as in a way bad moderns, that we are completely different from the beings with which and with whom we live and we share the terrestrial. And there seems to be a way of being able to reorient the attitude towards the other beings or entities in a quasi terrestrial way, and there seems to be a way of responding as societies with all of its technological possibilities towards these other non-human sides or parts of the terrestrial or the habitat. And of course, much of it probably would amount to a more ecological politics, a politics that knows the finitude or the limitedness of resources, that tries to adopt a non-exploitative, non-objectifying attitude. But it probably goes deeper, because he also seems to say, if we rethink politics and social relations in a terrestrial, quasi-terrestrial mode, this would change what we think about of others in the framework of the project of surviving or living at all. And there seems to be something like how should we call this? An ethics and a spirit, an ethos of ontological community, relationality, maybe even mutual respect. We should maybe even say mutual recognition, and not only of social actors and consciousnesses, but also of the different parts and elements of a life world that will not only be natural and not only be enabled with cognitive faculties. And this is, as I said, almost esoteric, because it's hard to say what this means, but it's for sure something that forces us to develop another sensibility, another sensitivity, and which is also a 1960s trope, of course. But he would also say that this is also something that will have effects on the social, organizational, or institutional level. And he also thinks that many of the problems coming with populist politics and a new regime of truth, which has to do with these post-truth developments, in a way is part of that picture, because only if you understand yourself as, in a way, sealed off or separate from the very world of facts in which you live, you might have the idea that you could get rid of facts by denying them. And for him, climate change denial is something like the master metaphor for this calamité of our present. So the problems are clear. This is pretty speculative. So it's hard to say what is to be done question can be answered here in specific terms. But interesting is, for me, are two things. The first is this will be cognitive and practical at the same time, because this is a Weltanschauungs- or worldview problem. In this sense, a problem of ontology. If we call ontology, let's say, the picture of the world you have and the picture of the different elements of the world you follow. But it also has a practical, institutional, political side, because he would think there are different modes of politics or social and political community, and the terrestrial as a kind of, as he calls it, an attractor or a kind of orientation would also change the practical institutional forms in which we communicate. And this goes back to his work on the so-called Parliament of Things, where he also was proposing that the non-human elements, being things in our life worlds and habitats, in the terrestrial, so to say, should also have a say in the strong political sense. And back then, this was, I think, 2001. This was as speculative as this text remains, and it's hard to spell out what the institutional consequences would be. But he has the ambition that this would also mean a reorientation of politics and social organization on the practical level. And this also, again, hinges on the question, who is doing the acting? Who is the subject of praxis? And here this text for us, anthropocentrists, this is pretty radical. And this goes far beyond everything we have discussed so far. And even Foucault, on this point, of course, is pretty classic. We all think political action is the matter of mainly social collectives, individuals coming together in political communities and distribute political agency. Sometimes we have interesting views about the relation between individual action and collective action, but that's as far as it goes. Latour says this picture is part of the problem. This will never solve it. This vision of politics will never exit this disaster scenario. because the disaster scenario is premised on the fact that we only think a couple of human beings, individuals or groups, will change anything. Whereas in reality, let's say, it's different. There are many more factors, many more entities, many more beings acting in some sense, having practical effect, in some other sense, having agency in this other sense that this theory attributes it to these entities. And rethinking politics will also mean rethinking these agencies or quasi-agencies. And this is, and that's clear, a huge provocation for us as theorists of action and theorists who pose the question, what is to be done? So let's face it.
Yeah. So, thanks. That was really brilliant in setting out the underpinnings of this text. The way you framed it, and the way you framed it makes me think hard about whether or not this is sufficiently addressing relations of power. And that's it's an odd concern, because there are portions of this and portions of the way that you were speaking about it, and there are portions of the text that seem to be more directly confronting those questions of relations of power than in a lot of his other work, I would say. And in part because it's so engaged with the moment, the historical moment, and the relations of power that have given rise to this moment. So the whole discussion of kind of loss of trust among those who deny, who are climate deniers, is a recognition of relations of power and of an elitism that has taken advantage and taken advantage of other populations and tried to seize and colonize, etc. So it's there, but at the same time, it's just not clear to me how to think through the political implications and the practical institutional side. And it's not clear to me that he's given enough attention to that. And so it ends up, maybe to me, it ends up being slightly gestural in the ways you were speaking, in part because he hasn't grappled hard enough, I think, with the way in which relations of power are going to influence any form of where we land for each and every one of us. And in part, that is, this whole question of relations of power, I think, have maybe plagued his work historically. And I'm thinking here about the way in which his intervention, his lifelong intervention, intellectual, right, has been about reversing the ethnographic gaze onto ourselves, but in a way that that never fully properly took into account relations of power. So for instance, it's clear that the work on laboratory life, going to a California lab instead of going to the Amazon to look at a tribe, right? I understand that completely. Or going to the Conseil d'État in France and writing a book about the Conseil d'État, which is the administrative tribunal. But in that move, and it no doubt we needed to correct the Orientalism and power, just horrific colonialism of anthropology, basically, in those early moments. But it always struck me that, I don't think the answer is for someone who doesn't know anything about lab life to go look at it the same way that we were looking at an Amazonian tribe. And I know, for instance, that someone not knowing anything about, say, academic politics could come sit in a faculty meeting and make the kind of remarks that that he would make about the lab. They laughed. I didn't understand this word. They then, exchanged something. They said something about an article. Then they said, and then they walked out the door. Well, I could tell you every single. I mean, if you know the space, if you've been trained in the space, every single gaze, every single look, every single pause, is meaningful, and it's meaningful because there are relations of power there. And so I think this is something that has haunted a little bit the work, which would suggest that, and that haunts a little bit this book, although it's being remedied at the same time. But then particularly when you get to this question of the practical institutional side, I can't imagine how we could make any progress whatsoever without an extraordinarily deep understanding and appreciation of relations of power in the context of, who's landing where and what we're going to do about it, Maybe you have a few thoughts, and then we can open it up to discussion.
This would be more a hermeneutical thought, that I would think, yes, you're right. In the end, this is a social and unsocial theory that maybe does not give power the also categorical status we, in other theories, attribute to it. And this is definitely something that we, from these other theories, would criticize. But I would give him some rope here, because not prioritizing power, of course, in his case also means that he would accuse us of having an almost fetishistic relationship to the notion and the concept of power. So he would say this is rooted too much in a certain kind of rubric matrix. And let's see if we cannot come pretty far with talking about the many, many different existing plural forms of action and agencies, which we will then, of course, again try to assess also in terms of inequalities of power, disproportionalities of power, different distributions of power. But he would say this is not the place to start, because the social world doesn't give away its power grammar. It gives away its many, many sides of possible action and actings. And these are the things the ethnographer can observe. And let's see if this doesn't amount to a picture that can then lead us to wanting to do things otherwise. And for me, I have to say, this is a tempting, a seductive proposal. As an arch Foucauldian, as you are one, I will probably ultimately reject it. And I would say, no, let's start at another point. But I see the force of this proposal when it comes to the question, are we really sure that we know who can act and cannot act? And is this not a problem that is even more fundamental than the question of where to see, detect, decipher power structures? So I'm at least open for this kind of provocation. And now someone would have to come and say, in this very case, namely in the question of ecology or climate or environmental politics, it's obvious that some of the things we cannot really fully address within the common framework or even the commonsensical framework that our politicians and we as citizens have. This testifies to the fact that there's something wrong also on the level of our background theories, our ontologies in that sense, of the very elements of the social and the natural. And for me, this manifesto probably doesn't really answer all of these questions, but it at least attempts to start a conversation that also says we need to revise our background theories, our ontologies, at the same time when we try to envision new forms of action that might address these calamities that don't seem to be addressable in the classical way. And now we can talk about the last climate politics agreement last week, whether is this sufficient or not. We could talk about the German government that thinks of itself as being one of the most ecologically progressive governments in the world, but at the same time, all they do is pampering the old-style, fossil automobile industry. It's crazy somehow. And Latour says this craziness has a system, has a logic. And to unlock this logic that makes us not see and makes us not act otherwise is worthwhile. But maybe someone wants to now defend or bolster this perspective.
Yeah. Were you going to jump in? Were you going to jump in?
Yes, in a moment. I need to.
Okay. You first then?
Hello, my name is Jonathan. I'm working on Marx, and maybe this is also the background of my question that I'm going to ask. So addressing the question of agency, where to look for it, to look for it at the margins of the system, to look for it maybe even outside of humanity. I think in order to get there, it would be a good idea to look back at the starting point of the question of the relationship between theory and practice, namely Marx thinking and the idea of historical materialism. And it seems like a large step back, but I will try to make it to bridge it and try to link the various texts in this way as well. So from my understanding, Marx materialism in the thesis on Feuerbach and afterwards starts out from the idea that this materialism that he wants to speak about is not one of contemplation only, of natural qualities, but one of practices. And very soon he continues to say, well, actually, these practices are obviously social practices. What is man, what is humanity, what is human, it's not only the natural qualities, but the main focus is on the social practices, der Mensch als das Ensemble gesellschaftlicher Verhältnisse. So the historical materialism becomes a materialism that says, actually what we need to be concerned about mostly with are the social practices. And it links theory and practice in the sense, and as Martin Saar was saying, in this dialectical sense, that these social practices are indeed the basis that our thinking will be built upon. We can not do otherwise than to be expressing the social practices and to be translating them into our thoughts. So from this understanding, of course, follows the 11th thesis of Feuerbach. Philosophers have only interpreted the world differently, but the point is to change it, because the interpretations will be based on the historical practices that exist. And so only interpreting it in a different way will not suffice, but as we encounter a bad reality, we will need to be changing it. Focus on the social practices, of course, led him to see that there are enormous contradictions in that society. And there is one class which expresses these contradictions as it is the result of these contradictions, of these social practices, which is the proletariat. And the proletariat is, of course, that point or that standpoint within these social practices that would, while being immanent to modernity, at the same time be able to go beyond it, pointing towards going beyond it. So as I understand all these problems in critical theory, Adorno and Marcuse in the 60s or even earlier on, is of course that this contradiction doesn't seem to work out in the way envisioned by Marx. So this immanent contradiction doesn't seem to be leading beyond capitalism anymore. The proletariat is not so much active in the sense of a revolutionary subject any longer. So the problems of theory and practice come into play for them, because this standpoint within the system that at the same time would go beyond the system has somehow been, how should you say, reconciled. Yes, exactly. I mean, integrated. The societal context is, of course, late capitalism. You have a welfare state, and the entire idea is these contradictions. They cannot become conscious to the people within these social practices, at the core of these social practices. So this is why. Adorno says we need to do the work of theory, we need to focus on that, and there is no easy path towards practice, and Marcuse tries to look for forms of practice at the margins of it. To link it to Latour and maybe our time today, there is this passage in Latour where he says the historical materialists actually have never been materialist. And of course, one of the main arguments or the main suggestions of his text is to say that the social aspect has been overvalued, and what needs to be considered more adequately is the geological aspect, is the agency that natural objects, whatever natural in that respect means, would also be able to have. And so my question with regard to this would be, if all these problems for critical theory on the relationship between theory and practice actually stem from a situation where ever larger parts of society became more affluent, became more integrated into the society. And if we look at the election results from the 60s, for example, the Grand Coalition was everything except 50 seats for the Liberal Party in Germany. Nowadays, we have a Grand Coalition which is almost, well, it's not possible any longer to have the majority, to bring together the majority of the population. So obviously, from a political perspective, not so many people seem to be integrated into the system any longer. And I think and the basis for this probably is that the economic integration process has somehow started crumbling down or breaking down. And the greater affluence is no longer spread to all parts of society, but rather they experience a situation of decreasing wages, ever more precarity in their jobs, and so on. So I think the situation is today a rather different one than the one of late capitalism, where actually Marcuse, Adorno were thinking about, and where they had the feeling that they would need to look at the margins and try to look for the breaking points outside of the system. And so my suggestion would be, shouldn't we rather be seeing again that there is a growing tendency again, that there are social contradictions within the system logics in our societies, be it economic crises, be it the fact that parts of society are no longer sharing in the affluence, the growing inequalities. And from looking at it from this background, is it really such a reasonable attempt to look for agency even further beyond human practices or social practices, namely at matter and the form of materialism that no longer takes social practices at its core, but something beyond that?
Thank you very much. And for me, it's very difficult to think through the relation between theory and practice. And from Marcuse and Foucault, I've learned that we cannot speak for others rightly. And now what I think is attractive in Latour is that he takes the background theories and all our preconditioned assumptions so much into account that we are permanently challenged somehow to take, to multiply our perspectives, to take the non-speakable or unspeakable in political terms into account. And as he wrote on 23, the multiplying perspectives, and on page 119, that we need to think through the invisible. That is the page from the French book. But my question is, can we think of those multiplying the perspectives and the invisibility through the Adornian terms that we have already heard so far, from as the non-identity between theory and practice, so that there's always this gap, this dialectical challenge between the way we act within the world, material world we live, that is at the same time evading our political perspective. And maybe a specific example would be the Gilets jaunes movement that was already mentioned, and whether this is not just an example that is not respecting every perspective, as or the ecological one, as they protested against the ecological taxation.
Okay, can I say something if no one is saying? It's a good chance to have the microphone.
Don't abuse it.
While it's here. Actually, I wanted to say about the relation between...
No, just face it to your mouth.
It's hard to... Okay, yeah. It's okay? The relation between practice and action, I mean, and also this question, what is to be done, is, I mean, actually this question asked, it was Chernyshevsky, probably, as I remember, Nikolai Chernyshevsky before Lenin, and he asked this question, and it was in a novel, and it was actually related to a certain kind of way of living also, that in order to change the world, you have to work on yourself. Maybe later, in a sorry, it's hard to say this word, to look back. Retrospectively, yeah, thank you. In a Foucauldian way, this is because, and in this regard, maybe we should give a chance to the Latour, because it is, yeah, as a manifest, he's maybe reacting or creating another image of a prophet who is creating his people, his subjects. That now I am writing this manifest, and now and here we know we have to act in a different way, and we can say we need a Foucauldian way of acting, which is the work on ourselves. You already mentioned this one, but actually this point has to be emphasized, and we have to emphasize on this point also. This is also a theory and practice problem, is always in its root also a practice of working on it, on her or his self problem. Yeah.
Great. So maybe we can respond to some of these and have some concluding thoughts. I mean, so several of the comments raised, I think, what is to me one of the central problematics, which is as we extend agency, wouldn't it become even more problematic and necessary to deal with the way in which those forms of agency are expressed by terrestrials, right? So, so it seems as if the directionality of the substratum and of thinking about the interrelations is almost as if what we're doing is we're expanding the space and creating even different problems and dimensions of how we could possibly express what could be these different forms of agency. So I too want to give as open a reading as possible and embrace as much as possible here, because of the insightful way in which in part it's dealing with issues of care of the self, or the self-transformation, or the subjectivity that is the transformations in subjectivity that are required to address these issues. My only thought is that without fetishizing questions of relations of power, that they become even more acute as we expand notions of agency. And maybe that's, maybe that's an advantage of doing that. But who is going to end up speaking on behalf, or how are we going to hear from these expanded agencies is a big question for me. As you were speaking, I did have this vision of Latour as kind of Zarathustra in this text coming down from the mountaintop, asking us indeed to kind of change ourselves completely. So thanks for that. But Martin, what do you think?
Yes, this is only the beginning of a conversation, even if we stop soon.
Yes, and we should.
But I would be in favor of apocalyptic speech at the moment. And I know you are too, in your own work. It might be right that at the moment it's absolutely necessary to dramatize and to say something like, the oceans are rising, and the oceans will rise, and they rise from themselves. Are we, the human species, responsible causally? Somehow, are we responsible morally, politically? For sure. Is the North more responsible than the South? Yes. Is capitalism as a system of indefinite accumulation responsible causally and normatively, whatever that means in that case? Yes. So what do we have to think through in this very precise historical moment? So what is to be done in thinking at the moment? I think Latour would say, think this through, that the oceans are rising, and they will rise, whatever you do, whatever you think, and whatever you say in your nice climate conventions. So there is more to be done because there's more happening. So more effects are being brought on the way while we talk. Many of them, most of them, Jonathan is right, will be mediated through social action. Social action is the action of humans organized in a certain way of social and economic forms. So there will be nothing unsocial about the rise of the oceans. It will be channeled through many, many human actions, and therefore social actions. And as I said, capitalism will be the main explanatory device for explaining what this is happening, next to, of course, physics and climatology and meteorology. And for me, Latour is just saying we have spent 200 years on social criticism, criticizing societies, questioning their authority, questioning the legitimacy of rulers and laws. And we are pretty good at it. It doesn't help the oceans from rising, because they rise out of a different dynamics, a different causal dynamics. And whether we like it or not, legal theory or sociology or political science will not stop the oceans from rising. And I have to say, I'm vulnerable to the vehemence, if this is an English word, of that thought. So Zarathustra, yes. So this is someone calling out, maybe even in the desert or coming from the mountain. But there is a point that socially mediated causality, political action, we were calling it politics, we were calling this traditionally, is part of that story, but not all of it. So we have to see where politics becomes physics and biology and becomes climate making, climate changing. And this will have to factor in all of the natural science kind of knowledge. And we were not good at integrating these areas of thinking and thought. For Hegel, this was still pretty connected, by the way. So he thought natural philosophy is, let's say, the first chapter of philosophy. We don't do that. We do philosophy proper. We do social criticism. We do legal theory. We criticize a lot, but we don't criticize the nexus of, sometimes we do when we talk about biopolitics, of life and politics and institutions, law and life and nature. And Latour, just at the moment, is the one philosopher who says these connections, these intersections, should be our core topics. These are not specializations. We don't do political theory and then we also talk about biopolitics. And as readers of Agam, we also know every politics is politics of life. And Latour just says every politics is politics of the earth. And the of the earth has two sides. It's the earth that we change and that we manipulate and that we exploit and extract. But it's also the politics that is possible under a given regime of the earth. And the earth is the one setting the conditions here. And the oceans are rising. And so just for the time being, I would say this basic intuition that our frameworks of theoretical category or categorical matrix of the social sciences and the humanities at the moment are not particularly adequate, not particularly prepared to address this level of where the natural and the non-natural, the social and the non-social, the institutional and the organic and the physical interact. This is just right. Mm-hmm. So he's onto something. Mm-hmm. I don't like the ideas about Europe and starting where you live and about the terroir. And I also fear that at the moment Latour would be pretty much in favor of the Gilets jaunes, irrespective of what they do and demand. I'm much more cautious here. But I see the point that we might have to start somewhere else than where we most of the time start, which is either power or social justice. Because these are the big paradigms at the moment. Foucauldianism or political liberalism. And I think Latour is right. We might not, within these confines, be really, really capable of addressing a couple of incredibly pressing issues. Because it could be, as he says on the second page, that neoliberalism, the problems of globalization, climate change and migration interconnect. Because climate change is also causing migration. Migration is also causing legal citizenship status, inequality, and populist phenomena. So this is not interconnected. The oceans are rising and the masses are on their way. It's pretty hard to go there and say something, and I think this book also testifies to the fact that it's almost impossible to say we must think completely different and then do it. And this book might not be the best exemplar of this new thinking, but I definitely subscribe to the need, to the Bedürfnis of this form of thinking.
I think that might be a good place to end our seminar. There's no doubt that the work itself is a deep critique of all of our disciplinary knowledges, right, that have so dramatically placed us where we are today. And a turn as it ends with this extraordinarily personal statement about, you know, where you stand, where I stand, right? And of course, I think the puzzle for us will be not only to take that turn and figure out where we stand, each and every one of us, but then to figure out what it entails for all of those knowledges that we've worked on and that we had mastered in such a devilish way. But it is a call, and maybe then we should end the seminar on his last paragraph, which will then allow us all to continue this conversation offline. And so he closes, "There, I've finished. Now, if you wish, it's your turn to present yourself. Tell us a little bit about where you would like to land and with whom you agree to share a dwelling place." So, thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all. Thank you very much.